And I use these skills on training my colleagues at the nursery. We now use scions that we prepare in the same day, and we graft. We graft millions of cashew seedlings per year, and some of those seedlings are grafted with scions collected, prepared and collected in the same day. This is a good achievement for us, because we use it to prepare 7 days before. So we have an impact in reducing the time of grafting. used these skills on training my colleagues at the nursery. We now use science that we prepare in the same day, and we graft. We graft millions of cashew seedlings per year, and some of those seedlings are grafted with science, prepared and collected in the same day. This is a good achievement for us, because we use it to prepare 7 days before. So we have an impact in reducing the time of grafting. these skills on training my colleagues at the nursery. We now use grafted with science, reducing the time of grafting. And I use these skills on training my colleagues at the nursery. We now use science that we prepare in the same day, and we graft. We graft millions of cashew seedlings per year, and some of those seedlings are grafted with science, prepared and collected in the same day. This is a good achievement for us, because we use it to before. So we have an impact in reducing the time of grafting. because we use it to skills on training Mike, and some of it is good achievement for us in reducing the time.
Recording in progress.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon to everyone, wherever you are across the world, and welcome to the 66th edition of the Global Markets Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick. I know Jim is connected and waiting to go on with it. But before I invite Jim Fitzpatrick, is also to let you know that we are coming to you in 2 languages. English, the main one with simultaneous translation into French, and you can select the language of your choice using the buttons. And then those of you on the other channels, you know how to also switch it to your languages. Again, let me also mention that we are live on Facebook and YouTube, and the session is being recorded. When it's time for the Q&A, we will stop the recording and allow everyone to come in freely with their questions. Again, let me mention that, as I said last time, we are now fully in Benin with the ACA 18th Annual Cashew Conference and Expo. And it's from the 17th to 19th of September in Cotonou, Benin, at the Sofitel Marina Hotel, and we expect all of you to be there. Again, let me acknowledge our partners and sponsors whose support has made this possible. And here I'm talking about the European Union, the OACPS, GIZ MoveCom Cashew, USAID, CICC, Cashew Info, and the Sustainable Nuts Initiative. On this note, let me welcome Jim Fitzpatrick. Hi, Jim. I see you are really ready. And with a nice picture in the background, that is a Cashew Club, who have always been behind us in this journey. So, Jim, you need no introduction, but then, of course, Jim is an international consultant, a business coach, and a cashew expert. And he's going to take us through the session for today. Hi, Jim. Are you there?
Morning, Ernest. How are you?
I'm fine. How about you?
Yeah, all good. Thanks.
Very
Good
good.
morning,
Okay, so
everyone.
Jim, please, the floor is yours, and all the best with the session.
Thanks, Ernest. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. There's been a lot of talk recently, and today we're going to have a look at some of the numbers behind the talk. And we're going to find that a lot of the numbers don't justify a lot of the talk. And we're going to do that by talking about the markets, and we'll have a particular look at some of the trade figures and try and put some perspective on those. If this time, we'll also have a look at processing, the progress of cashew processing in Africa, particularly in West Africa, given the time of year. And we'll ask the question, is it different this time? And it is, in my opinion. So let's start with the markets, but don't forget, you can find all of these sessions on YouTube, on the African Cashew channel, the channel of the African Cashew Alliance. And they're all there, going right back to the first one, which is 66 sessions ago. So we'll have a look at the market and we'll try and put some perspective, and we look at figures, and I'll explain to you my conclusion, why the numbers do not confirm the chat, particularly some of that dramatic language that we've been hearing and reading in the marketplace really since the beginning of April. So let me just, again, as I have done the last couple of sessions, just talk about some of these indicators. So I like to distinguish between the numbers, which are generally reliable, not all, but most. Things like the imports of RCN, things like the exports of kernels, shipments, and some of the price reports. So those are reliable numbers. And then on the other hand, we have opinion. Opinion's good, and opinion is often constructive. but sometimes it can be misleading. So it's really important for us to identify what's fact or numbers, what's opinion, and what are reports. And it's often important to ask the motivation behind reports, the level of information and capacity behind the reports, and the market databases that back up those reports. Of course, you should also be asking those questions of anything that we talk to you about on this webinar every 2 weeks, because we all need to check on each other to make sure that we get the story right and that we don't mislead. The consequences of misleading can be grave. So let's try and focus on what's opinion. So I'm going to talk to you today, and some of what I'm going to tell you is fact, and some of it's opinion, and some of that is my interpretation of the numbers. So the first part is all opinion, this first section. We're talking about the farm gate prices. I'm seeing them as steady, but not really taking off. There are exceptions, maybe in Senegal, maybe in Guinea-Bissau, but elsewhere farm gate prices can be described as no more than pretty steady. To me, it does look like a lower crop in 2024, but I'm still undecided. I'm still calculating. I'm still gathering information, as we all probably are, and still I'm in this margin of it's down somewhere between 7 and 15%. So it's not a crop disaster or a catastrophe, and you will have read those words in some of the journals lately. Secondly, international RCN, we've definitely seen sellers mark up their offers. We've seen buyers become more cautious. They're looking at kernels prices. Yes, kernels prices have gone up, but some of the RCN offers don't really make sense in the current kernels market, and I'll talk to you about that in a little while. We'll have a look at some of those numbers. Demand is super right now. Good demand. Obviously, prices have moved up. Vietnam processors, the primary supplier for the world, have marked up their prices. African processors are selling, and they continue to make some really good premiums. India's exports steady, but not really increasing. Brazil exports reflect Brazil's crop. Downstream kernels still very strong. At the moment, I think we're seeing sellers a little bit reluctant to make offers, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but buyers still appear to be relatively calm. Are these high prices for cashews? Not really. Not really in the history. They're high compared to 6 months ago, but they're not high compared to 6 years ago. So let's have another look. Let's go and dig into some of the numbers. We'll start with Vietnam. And I always start with Vietnam because, don't forget, Vietnam has a huge market share, the biggest processor in the world, the biggest exporter of cashew kernels. We'll start by looking at the imports of raw cashew nuts. So year on year, January to the 15th of May, up by about 17%. In fact, that period, January to the 15th of May, is the highest import for that period in history. And you can see by the first half of May, imports have broken 1 million tons. Now, it has happened before that 1 million tons has been broken by May, but as far as I can see, not by the first half of May. So you can see imports 1.08 million tons. It's interesting, isn't it? Vietnam has imported in 5 months, 4.5 months actually, almost what India imported in an entire year last year. That just gives us some idea of the balance of the volume in processing. And sometimes it's a good idea to look at some of the comparisons. So even if we look back 2023, you can see how far ahead imports are. The blue line is 2023, and back another year, 2022. So early in the year, relatively slow start. January, February again was below last year, March again, but since then it's really started to pick up, and we are seeing now pretty high levels of imports. And key question is, where are they coming from? So let's have a look at the sources. So when we look at this, so this is January to the end of April. I don't have the country by country analysis for the 15th of May. But if we look at January to April, well, what jumps out immediately is, of course, Cambodia. So Vietnamese customs authorities are reporting that they have imported almost 705,000 tons by the end of April from Cambodia. That compares to 482,000 tons for the same period last year. First question is, does that look like a short crop? Of course it doesn't. So we've been hearing estimates of the crop in Cambodia anywhere from 650,000 tons up as high as 800,000 tons. And it looks now as if this crop is much more like a normal crop than was expected a month ago. Again, we get into this fallacy that back in February, people were talking about 1 million tons. 1 million tons has only been never done once in Cambodia. You talk about a big, big number, it comes in a little bit less, you start to go, wow, there's a problem. There's not a problem. It doesn't look, these numbers tell us there's not a problem right now. So there may be, and we heard Andara, the chair of the Cambodian Cashew Federation, talking to us 2 weeks ago on this webinar, telling us that he felt that because more cashews were being dried locally, that there were probably more nuts being held back. So therefore, I think it's reasonable to expect that this figure, this 705,000 tons will go up. Let's have a look at some of the other countries. And we see Cote d'Ivoire, obviously in January to April, you don't get huge imports into the country from West Africa, but we'll take a look. Cote d'Ivoire figures down about, significantly down about 20,000 tons from 55,000 tons. Nigeria is slightly up. Tanzania down, but when we look at India, we'll see why that is. Ghana slightly up, and all others slightly down. So what we see is a big spike in Cambodia. Now, we shouldn't necessarily interpret 705,000 tons by end of April, meaning that the crop is 1 million tons or anything like it. What we can say is that trade's been active, prices have been better, and product has moved. Is there anything left in Cambodia? Chances are there is. Elsewhere, it's a little bit early to judge. Perhaps lower imports from Tanzania into Vietnam are indicative of the prices paid in Tanzania and the situation in India in October, November and December. Some of these figures, by the way, just to note that some of the figures from Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, may well include some product that was in transit warehouses at the end of 2023. So some of it might be old crop. And this might partially explain the difference in some of the figures. Let's have a look at Vietnam's exports. So again, these figures are from the Vietnamese customs authorities. Again, 35%, just under 35% up January to May. And if we look, so the blue bars are the exports this year, and the lines reflect the trend in previous years, 23, 22 and 2021. Again, we're seeing a record. 31% up at the end of April. That had risen to 35% by the 15th of May. First half of May on its own was up 41% on the first half of May last year. And I mention that because it shows that this growth is being sustained right into the month of May. So looking at this, we can see exports by the 15th of May, 249,000 tons. That's about the same number as the end of June in 2022, which would mean that we could say it's about 6 weeks ahead of the trend. And if we look at 2023, we're looking at a figure which is about halfway through June. So versus 2023, which, don't forget, was a record year for exports, we could be about 2 weeks ahead, 6 weeks ahead of 2024. What does that mean? Well, I'd like to put this in a longer term perspective. And if we look at January to April and compare it to 5 years ago, so 5 years ago, remember, is pre-COVID. There's no COVID influence on that. We're back at 2019. It's increased by 100,000 tonnes for this 4.5 month period. That's up 64%. So if you just try and put that into some kind of perspective, converting it to RCN, let's say about 450,000 tonnes, that's about 60% of the entire Cambodian crop. So this growth in demand is beginning to eat into the surplus. So a surplus was created after many years of finely balanced or deficit situations. That's why we had higher prices. A surplus was created 2021 into 2022 by the arrival of big production from Cambodia. That's still the case in a normal year. This year is not a normal year, but that is still the case in a normal year, and that's what we would expect next year, given a good crop. But it would appear that demand has eroded that surplus by about half. So that means that the idea, the prediction, the opinion that by about 2027, probably 2028 maybe, we're going to be in a situation where, again, supply and demand is balanced. That would mean in a year of a small crop, you get a deficit. And you know what that might mean in the future. So let's have a look at the Vietnamese balance sheet. Now, this is opinion. Let me be very clear about this, because some of this we know. So we know what's been exported. We know what's been imported. We have a good idea about the Burma imports. The opening stock at the beginning of the season is an opinion. It's an opinion of various people, and I bring various people's opinions together and try to come to a conclusion. To a certain extent, the crop in Vietnam is also an opinion. But if we put all this together, a mix of fact and opinion, if we consider the opening stock, so this is the opening stock including the work in progress. So that includes what's in factories. I'm not suggesting there's a big surplus of RCN lying around. What I'm saying is there was product around at the end of the year in the process for use in the coming year on ships, obviously from Tanzania, for example, on ships from elsewhere. If we put all that together, so you take opening stock plus the crop, less the export and consumption, plus the imports, plus the import of Burma kernels, you'd come out to a stock based on the first 4.5 months usage of about 70 days in Vietnam. Now, to that you could add what's afloat. So what's coming from Ivory Coast, about 270, 280,000 tons, some going to India, some going to Vietnam, and whatever might be afloat from other countries like Nigeria, like Ghana, and so on. Now, in these figures, that would mean 70 days processing versus a voyage of, let's say, 70, 80 days from purchase to getting the product in, plus some afloat. That would seem to say that the situation that we read in some of the reports about extreme shortages might only apply to certain factories and not to others. That overall the numbers suggest that the situation is not quite in extreme shortage for raw material. By the way, I use 24% as the outturn yield for this calculation simply because we're talking about first 2, 3, 4 months of the season in Vietnam. We're talking about Vietnamese RCN, we're talking about Cambodian RCN, and that has quite high outturn rates on the cutting test. For the whole globe, for the year, I would use 22%, which includes the process losses, of course. So maybe in Vietnam, it doesn't look as acute a difficulty, assuming further shipments follow on. And maybe this brings to light one of the things about cashews, that we can talk about short crops here and there, but throughout the year, with only 2 months really, there's a crop coming from somewhere. There's a crop on the way from Mozambique in January, all the way through Guinea-Bissau, Senegal, shipping into July, into August, and then by September, East Africa, Tanzania, and a little bit later Mozambique and Brazil kick in. So there are raw cashews coming in all year round. And this is why sometimes we don't see the impact of a short crop, except if it's in a big country, in a big producer like Cote d'Ivoire or India. So right now we're not getting many offers from Vietnamese processors, and they have marked their prices up, and I think they're right to do that. Why is that? Why will they not offer? Well, by the looks of it, it's not a shortage of raw material. It might be the perception of a shortage of raw material, but it may also be that some have bought and some have not bought. It may be that those that have bought are well organized, well financed, and they have also sold forward, so they don't have anything to sell. Smaller processors who might work a little bit more hand to mouth, they may be tight in those positions. Secondly, simply RCN prices have moved up, as we've seen. The cost of raw material has risen. That means the cost of kernels will rise. It also means you need more working capital. Third reason, processors have sold forward when prices were low. So they're anxious not to get burnt. Now, if you've sold forward, and it's an easy mistake to make, if you've sold forward, and we know there were quite aggressive sales forward earlier in the year, if you've sold forward and you haven't bought that raw material, you're in trouble. If you've sold forward and you have bought it at higher prices, you're in trouble. If you've bought the kernels from people who are in trouble, you too may be in trouble. And that's one of the risks. And that's one of the things that can cause a second spurt on prices in cashews. The first one from the fundamentals, the second one then from the renegotiation, the contract default, delays in shipment should be expected. There could be some choppy times ahead. Now, if we talk about a price rise from 240 to 280, is that enough to throw someone into difficulty? Yeah, it probably is. 240 to 250 to 260, perhaps not, but you're looking at 40 cents a pound. And don't forget, a lot of processors, they experienced delays from their buyers a few years ago when prices started to fall quickly. Back in 2022, when prices started to fall quickly, many buyers deferred shipments. Some of them renegotiated the prices. So let's bear in mind, it works both ways. That's Vietnam. Let's have a look at India. So India's monthly imports. So we have figures up to March and we have provisional figures for April. I again get my figures from the Indian Ministry of Commerce. That's my source. Sometimes you get some variation. Again, we're looking at fairly healthy import figures historically speaking. January, April is well up, almost 40% up versus last year. Now, last year was a little bit on the low side because there were quite a lot of inventories knocking around from the previous year, but it's 15% up on 2022. Biggest April for 10 years. That's quite interesting in terms of demand, in terms of perception. You got about 288,000 tons imported into India in the first 4 months of the year. So that's relatively healthy situation so far for India. We'll have a look at some of the sources of Indian raw nuts. Clearly, again, we see West African shipments in the case of Ghana, behind in the case of Cote d'Ivoire, although it's not a particularly important supplier in this period, behind. And Benin, interestingly, despite a ban on exports, Benin's supplies to India have increased by almost, well, by more than 10,000 tons in January to April. So it's interesting to know exactly what's happening there. So this most likely is material that's been moved across the border. But a bigger story than this, for now at least, is the increase in imports to India from Tanzania and from Mozambique. So this means that traders and processors in India, looking back in November, December, January, thought this is a good opportunity. They paid some higher prices for Tanzanian because of its quality, and they bought Mozambique material probably at lower prices. But the two figures have almost doubled. We're looking at a big increase. So this is sustaining India to a certain extent. And again, I'm not saying that there's a lot of raw cashew nuts lying around unsold in India. I don't think that's true. But I do think that for the moment, the numbers suggest that India is reasonably well supplied compared to previous years. Now, May, June for India would be the time when you would see a lack of shipments from Benin, for example. You might see a gap from Ghana. You might see again this figure a little bit lower in percentage terms later in the year, because we had that gap in Ghana between the first and the second crops. So we've had a look at Vietnam, we've had a look at India. We've seen, number one, RCN imports quite healthy. We will look at production a little bit later. And what we're seeing is that, at least in terms of the numbers, the supplies are at least as good as last year, if not better. We've also seen that Vietnam's exports are well up, and obviously that's affected their balance sheet, but we've calculated that Vietnam has about 2 months of stock, which is adequate because that would allow shipments from West Africa to reach. So let's have a look at kernels demand, and let's see if we can figure out whether or not this is likely to be sustained. First of all, we're going to take Vietnam's exports as the guideline. Again, Vietnam, 74% of the European market, 95% of the Chinese market, 89% of the US market. It's a pretty good guide as to how the business is going. And as you can see, orange bars 2023 shipments, blue bars 2024 shipments. And you can see the blue bars in every case way ahead. In fact, when we look at it, we see shipments to major markets, North America, obviously mainly the United States, up 34%. Shipments to China almost doubled. Remarkable. And shipments to Europe up 26%. So at the same time, although there is a little bit lesser growth in East Asian markets, these are East Asian markets excluding China, and West Asia, so West Asia is Middle East, Central Asia in this calculation, but still very strong numbers. Perhaps not as strong as last year, but nonetheless very strong numbers. So what we're seeing right now is that China and the United States, and I suppose Europe, although that was signaled earlier, we saw that in the second half of last year from Europe, but certainly China and the United States have started to drive export figures from Vietnam. Very good signals for demand. Slight slowing. So I think what we're getting is a slight slowing in the countries that see a fast reaction to price changes. And we're seeing a little bit of a catch up in markets like North America or Europe. Now there might be, particularly in the US figures, there might be a factor in their earlier year reaction to restricted shipments and longer voyage times due to the problems in the Gulf and with the Suez Canal. So it could be part of that. you could see a slight tapering off of this trend later in the year for that reason. It could also be that buyers were conscious that they had bought at very attractive prices and they wanted to get their product moved as soon as possible. Time will tell, but for now, it looks really constructive. Let's have a look at some of those key markets. So we'll start and look at the US market. So here we have, again, in the usual style, 3 months, January, February, March, US imports. We don't have April just yet. And we're comparing those to the previous 3 years, 23, 22 and 2021. And again, what we see is that by the end of March, the figures in the US were just under the figures for 2022, but well ahead of 2023 and well ahead of 2021. First 4 months of 2022 was a very healthy time for US imports. Could that happen again? It's possible that you get, a really good first half and a really poor second half. I don't think so. US imports are up 28% on the first quarter of last year. Now, we're not talking about shipments from Vietnam anymore. We're talking about actual arrivals into the US. And this is for natural cashew kernels. This is not the roasted kernels included. Second best first quarter in history. That's a really strong indicator. It's a strong indicator that demand last year was pretty good. It's a strong indicator of optimism. And of course, it's an indicator that prices were very attractive. If we look at processed cashews, roasted processed cashews into the United States is becoming an interesting item. Imports have risen 16% in each of the last 2 years. This year, first quarter imports are up 32% versus last year. So you've about 9,800 tons or so going into the US in the first 3 months of the year. Packed, roasted, salted, mostly in bulk. Consumer packs could probably be added onto this, but most of this would be bulk roasted. Again, the best first quarter in history. So this is certainly optimistic for US imports. If we look at the situation and then we've taken imports and now we look at shipments from Vietnam. So shipments to the US during March from Vietnam were up 23% and during April they were up 32%. Logically, those shipments have to arrive. So the March shipments will arrive into May and the April shipments will arrive into June. So it looks right now as if these strong import figures will continue to be seen in the US market until the end of June. We also know there's been some buying more recently, so we can expect, I think, on what we're seeing, a relatively optimistic outlook for US imports, a return to form, if you like, for the US market in 2024. But Vietnam completely dominates the increased imports. So if we look at the major origins, looking at Côte d'Ivoire, we see a decline in trade into the United States in the first quarter. If you look on India, we see there's a slight increase, but it's only a few tons. Brazil, again, a decline in Brazil's trade on cashew kernels with the United States in the first quarter. But the rest of Africa has increased. So countries like Nigeria, Benin actually, Ghana have all seen increases. So what we're seeing in the US market is a clear signal that the increase is dominated by Vietnam, and that's a signal that it's price. Côte d'Ivoire down, Brazil down, and the rest of Africa just taken together is up, which is obviously positive, but from relatively low numbers. So that might be some concern for African cashew processors when they look at the US market. The market share versus 2023 has dropped to 6.4% from 7.4% in 2023. So we've a lower market share for African countries. Let's move on and have a look at another key market, or what's become a key market is China, and we'll also look at East Asian countries. So East Asian countries, Japan, Korea, I've included Australia, Malaysia, Indonesia. These are all important import markets, Thailand too. So if we look at the long-term trend, so in red is China, in blue is a group of East Asian major importers. So what we're seeing is that Chinese imports have been going up in this unusual up and down pattern. Now, we do know that from 2022 prices in the market were much lower, and so perhaps that's the reason for the sharp increase. But if we try to smoothen this out, we see that China's 5-year growth is 8% per annum, which is remarkably quick. If we look in East Asia, so I've taken 11 markets in East Asia, and that gives us a 5-year growth of 5.25%, both very healthy figures. So if we look at shipments, trying to tune in, focus in on China-Vietnam relationship, we know that Vietnam dominates the Chinese market, and the reasons for that are pretty easy to understand. And we would have to ask the question, is China now at the level of demand which many people expected for many years, where it would kick into the type of growth that would see the Chinese market become similar, maybe bigger to the US market or the European market, although not quite at the levels of India. But if we look at the shipments month by month, what we see is a really big January and a really big April, with March positive, but not as big as the other two. February, festival time, closed factories in both countries, no surprise. Figures are low, so the difference or the decline doesn't really mean an awful lot. That's about timing of the festivals. So Vietnam's shipments to China are almost double the 2023 level. This is about seasonal demand. It's about festivals, but the figures are much bigger than they've been for many, many years. So whereas we're looking at growth in Asian markets of 5% in Japan, something in the region of 8% in Korea, although the Indonesian market, which is interesting as a producer, Indonesia has been growing. Indonesia's imports have been growing at 20%. Indonesia's production has not been growing. So that's quite an interesting trend. But the big question we're asking in Asia is China now at a stage where we're going to see this move on? We're going to see it accelerate. And that would be, in 10 years, that would mean, if this level of growth continues, that would mean in 10 years, China would buy enough cashews to handle the entire Cambodian crop. Just as a kind of a benchmark for us when we think about supply and demand. Let's have a look at prices. We've talked about trade, we've talked about demand. Let's have a look at prices. Let's see if we've had many changes. So here's I like this long-term price chart. I like to be able to sit back from it and take a look at what's happened over a long, long period. So this chart goes back now 2020, 22 years in fact. If we look at the recent price range, I'm going to take a low of 240. Yeah, you can tell me it traded lower than that. I'll accept that, but I don't think it was traded much below that by many people for significant volume. And I'm going to take a level of 280 for the current market. Again, people might say that's a little on the low side, but I'm trying to get an average between lower price processors and the top high quality, highly reliable processors. And here we've got our price. We've seen this is the the price rise. You couldn't really call it a sustained rise yet, but it has happened. It has spiked up. Are cashews expensive at these prices? No, because remove the last couple of years, remove the period back to mid 2022, and cashew kernels, and this is 320s as usual, have been above this price level from that point all the way back to 2010. So are we out of the low price period for cashew kernels? No. What we are is, we maybe is out of this time when, as often happens in cashews, when it goes up too far. Back in 17 we saw that. Back in 2011 we also saw that. It goes up too far and then it crashes. But when it goes down, it tends to go down too far as well. And there's evidence of that in previous periods. And I think what we are now is we're out of the period of overdone. Some people would say overdone on the downside. In other words, it's gone too low for too long. And now we're seeing a correction in that. Interestingly though, it's taken a scare, and I'm still calling it a scare on the crop, to get us to that point. But if we look at it, we're now at 2-year highs, but we're still 17%. That's a lot below 5-year highs. And we're still 4% below the 5-year average. So my argument is, we're coming out of the 2-year period. We're coming back into the 5-year average realm. That would suggest that there might be a little bit of upside left in this market. That doesn't mean it's going up today, tomorrow, next week, next month, but it means that fundamentally speaking, a further increase in price is not likely to seriously damage demand. Key question though, when we look at this, and a key concern is that in that period, we've all the open kernels contracts, all the forward kernels contracts that were done would have been done in this period of lower prices. So as of the 1st of April, let's say, all forward contracts were in this lower price range, which means that as of the 1st of June, the likelihood is that all contracts that are open are below the market, and probably significantly below the market. That's a worry. People behave differently when they're losing money. Simple as that. People behave differently when they're trying to talk about how to get themselves out of a position where they may still need to buy RCN, but they've also got to deliver their kernels contracts, and their reputation is on the line. People have used words like skyrocketed for cashew kernels prices. This is not skyrocketed. This is simply the market moving back to a level that makes a little bit more sense. This is not 2017. This is not 2011, nor 2008. This is more or less a correction in prices back up to workable levels. They've gone too low. They're back to something like being workable. Where are they? Let's have a look at the 320 prices. So I just put this list together yesterday just to have a quick look. The lowest price I've seen on a quote for Vietnamese WW320s is $2.75, and the average of the higher prices, which range well up to $3, but the average of the higher prices is around $2.85, taking a mix of what's been traded, what's on offer, and what people are prepared to pay. India's exports have been marked up, no surprise. And in West Africa, we're seeing prices ranging, or at least I'm seeing prices ranging from 280, which I know was traded, up to 290, which I know also was traded. And then I'm seeing some offers around 295. Some people may need more. Why are West African prices still at a premium? Well, for buyers in some markets, especially Europe, the freight is lower, the quality may be better, the certification may suit them, and they may simply want to diversify their sources of supply. None of this compares to the Indian domestic market, which is still way up there. But don't draw the immediate conclusion that processors in India are making a fortune because their domestic market is so high. Let's have a look at that. So now we're looking at a cost of kernels. I'm trying to do a comparison here. So what I do is I take the cost and freight or the farm gate price. I add on the costs to deliver it to the factory. I then factor in an average cost of processing for a typical processor in any one of the countries. And I do that for a couple of different origins. You add in the cost of processing. These are the cost and freight and the outturn that I've used in each case. I've tended to use the higher end of the market in this case. And this is what you would get. So these are the costs on average for all kernels. So this is not a 320s cost. This is the price for all kernels. So Ghanaian material processed in Vietnam, Guinea-Bissau £51 processed in India, Guinea-Bissau £51 processed in Vietnam, Ivorian, an efficient Ivorian factory, which means a well-managed large-scale factory processing in Côte d'Ivoire, Benin, imported Ivorian in Vietnam, because obviously you have a different calculation if you're importing Cambodian and processing it. You might be sending that to China anyway. And then average market, and that adjusted for the grades. And what you see using these RCN prices, the conclusion we can draw is that actually RCN prices have run ahead of the kernels market. So the margin, let's say on Ivorian raw cashew nuts at the current quoted price that I've used is $1,200, and being realistic on the quality, I've used £45. So this will be for new shipments. There's not enough margin between the cost and the potential sale price. In fact, in some countries, in Benin, offer Bissau material in Vietnam, you'd actually make a loss if you paid today's offered price and sold at today's kernels market. It's just an indicator. So for me, this does justify some of the things I've heard from processors saying that RCN prices are gone. We can't say too high, because it could also be that kernels prices are too low. What we can say is that they don't match. And I think we're back in this situation. Now, we all thought that a correction in kernels prices that's happened would correct this situation and processors would be back in good shape. But that it seems to have gone a little bit too far. So we can conclude tentatively, because the information is not perfect, of course, but we can certainly say indications are that raw cashew nuts from West Africa offered at the current prices do not work well for Vietnamese processors. Ivory Coast origin processing works. You can see here the yellow bar. This is for local processing in the country. It works. Low, very low farm gate prices. Yes, lower quality and not too far distances to travel makes it work. But in Benin, because of higher farm gate prices and generally higher cost structure, origin processing is again under pressure to be profitable. In India, it does work. The calculation works because the domestic market is that much higher. You saw on the last slide where I showed you that it was in the region $3.50 to $3.60 for 320s. So it can work, but again, margins would be eroded for Indian processors, and we haven't done the calculation for Ivorian or Nigerian raw nuts to be processed in India. If this was to be back in balance, the average price for cashew kernels would have to move up, according to my calculations, by more than 10 cents a pound. So the 280 we took as a kind of an average level would have to become a 290. Now, two things can happen. Well, in fact, three things can happen. The first thing is kernels could go up to balance the situation. The second thing is raw cashew nuts could come down, $50 a ton to make enough difference. The third thing is that processors could go on losing money, but I don't see the third one as likely anymore. I think processors have decided that they're just not prepared to lose money. Now, that's good news for African processors, by the way. It means that if local raw nuts at lower prices and you're running a factory that's relatively efficient, that's at the right scale, and you're making the right product, it works right now. It works really well. You can be competitive. Everything is in favor. Let's have a look at production. Again, lots of chat around production. I'm going to do a quick whirlwind tour based on some of the comments from our speakers from last time around. You remember we had 4 great speakers. I've had a chat with each one of them. I've had a look locally in each of the countries, and this is what I'm finding. So in Cambodia, we've spoken about the export trade. If that figure from Vietnamese customs is right, and there's no reason to believe it's not, 705,000 tons, the crop must be at least 750,000 tons. That's a pretty good crop. Now, what we might be seeing is that more hectares have come online, so that perhaps some areas have had a harder time, but more hectares have come online this year, and that's compensated for poorer growing conditions for others. If we look in Vietnam, the crop, I get various figures, between 300 and 320,000 tons. That's a low crop. The 20,000 tons doesn't make a huge difference. Imports strong. Inventories, my calculated version of inventories, 70 to 75 days of processing. Forward position, sold, low prices. That's a key factor. So when I look at this in Vietnam, I'm seeing relatively conservative buying patterns, much more careful buying of RCN. And I'm wondering if the general thinking in the market, the sentiment as they call it, in the market hasn't changed. Maybe this has gone from, let's get RCN prices down as low as we can. Let's, target, as was done earlier in the year, around 950. That's not going to happen. So in the absence of being able to do that, maybe we need to look at this as getting kernels prices back to where they should be. And maybe driving kernels prices down wasn't the ideal thing to do. And that would certainly seem to be the case when you look at a forward position sold probably somewhere between, on average, 250 and 260 for 320s, and a cost somewhere 265, 270. Looking at India, I'm reliably informed that the outlook has improved a little bit. There have been some rains. It's unlikely to be a big crop in India from what I'm told, but it's beginning to look a little bit better than some of the earlier forecasts. Demand in India is good. People tell me from various parts of the country that demand is good, and imports, as we've seen, 288,000 tons, well ahead of last year. So in these 3 countries, as the harvest is finished in Vietnam, it's coming to an end in Cambodia, and it's still going on in India, we have a much better idea now of the overall situation. Let's have a look in West Africa. So I suppose the first thing to note is that quality is lower across almost every country. Maybe Guinea-Bissau at the moment is an exception, which would suggest Senegal might be too, but I haven't heard that. But I have heard that in Guinea-Bissau so far, the quality is pretty good. Looking in the countries, Nigeria, I get a wide range of numbers. And I haven't been to Nigeria since last summer, so I can't say from first-hand experience. But we are seeing a range of estimates from 250,000 to 400,000 tons. I cannot see how it would be 400,000 tons. I think there is some old crop material. Someone mentioned an estimate of 50,000 tons left. That's being blended in. There is material flowing in from Benin into Nigeria, as it always has done. Prices are steady. I think they're looking at maybe a crop, which would be quite a good crop, close to 300,000 tons on what I understand at the moment. Looking in Ghana, prices are stable. Estimates of the crop not as good as was estimated officially, But then again, not many people thought that that official estimate was right. So if I say 150,000 tons total crop might be about right. Into Ghana right now, you're seeing product flowing from Cote d'Ivoire because the ban of exports. And naturally and always you'll see product flow down from Burkina Faso into Ghana, into Togo for export. Benin harvest coming to an end. The main feature, it is tight. If you want to buy RCN domestically in Benin, it's tight and prices are high. But this is probably more due to cross-border trade into Togo, as I mentioned, into Nigeria for re-export. So it's a tough time for processors in Benin again. Just as they thought they were getting this matter sorted out, the situation develops. Now the export ban is in place, but it's not really effective at the moment. Products can flow out. So a lot of work needs to be done. I'm not saying that long-term an export ban isn't a bad idea, but what I'm saying is that it needs to be done in conditions where it makes sense. If we look at Burkina Faso, I think that production is well down on the forecasts. One or two people told me earlier that they expected a crop of 150,000 tons. I've never seen that. I still don't see it. RCN supply is limited, and I think there are obviously some problems with the crop, but there are obviously security and movement problems too in the country, unfortunately, at the moment. So I think probably a lower crop than would be expected. And Ivory Coast, Cote d'Ivoire, I'm going to talk about that in a minute. The crop is still coming in. The quality is lower, there's no question about that. The quality of the early crop was lower, but now we're getting into May, June, and the quality of the raw material always goes down in this period. In a good year, in a poor year, it always goes down. Numbers, the lowest number I've heard is an estimate of 900,000 tons, but I don't think these are informed estimates, to be very frank. I think people pick a number, read the news, chat to a few people, pick a number. But if we look at the situation, I think it's reasonable to expect a crop in excess of 1 million tons, which would have been a spectacularly good crop only 3 years ago. So put it in perspective. The perspective is not last year's crop, which was the biggest ever and a bumper crop. The perspective is the average over the last few years, and it's probably, in volume terms, not as bad as might have been spoken about. So let's just have a look at that. So what is happening in Cote d'Ivoire, or what can we figure out from what we hear in Cote d'Ivoire? Remind ourselves, first of all, the country is the largest producer of cashew nuts in the world. In 2023, more than 860,000 tons actually was the number, was exported in 2023. So it's a big, big supplier, and processing in the country is increasing quickly. 265,000 tons was the estimate of processing in 2023. 325,000 tons is this year's target, and that may well be reached. There are a lot of new factories. Each factory that's been established is coming up toward capacity after 3-4 years. So that may well be reached. It may well even be exceeded. So since the 7th of May, the government has suspended the export of raw cashew nuts. It's about 2 weeks now. It is clearly a temporary measure, and it has happened before. In fact, it happened earlier this year, and it was hardly noticed by a lot of us. It came and it went. Why has it been done? It's been done to support processing in the country, to allow some of the national processors. So by that, it means the Ivorian-owned, mostly wholly Ivorian-owned factories to buy their raw cashew nuts. And so far, they've had 2 weeks to do that. And I understand this came from a very high level, not just from the CCA, the regulatory body, but from a very high level in the country. What's been its impact? Well, so far, processors can buy more. National partnerships, all processors can buy more. But the weaker processors who didn't have money to buy raw cashew nuts before the export ban, they still don't have money to buy during the export ban. Raw prices at the farm gate are relatively stable. I heard figures of 300, 325. Now this is farm gate, remember. Delivered will be more expensive than that. But this is what I'm hearing. 300, 325. Somebody told me also that prices were below 300 in some areas. Of course, it's related to quality. RCN prices in the largest producer in the world are the lowest in the world at the moment. That's something of a sobering thought for me. Goods that were approved for export either in the port or on the way to the port before the ban, that's before the 7th of May, were exported or can be exported. And that's 2 weeks ago. So it's probably reasonable to assume that most of that has been moved in the meantime. Trade can still go on in the country. You can still buy your raw cashew nuts, but you just can't export them for now, or you can't move them to the port for export. And of course, a little while ago, I had a look at the map. I showed you, we were talking about Ghana, and I showed you the trade on that border, what that trade is naturally going to increase in these circumstances. And that's what we're seeing. But strangely in this, and it's a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction, I think international RCN prices went up. So I think that's probably an overreaction. Maybe people missed out on this word, temporary. Maybe people missed out on the fact that, as we saw earlier, imports into Vietnam, imports into India are at quite strong levels. So that a 2-week, 3-week, 4-week probably doesn't make a huge difference. Now, if it goes on longer than that, it does make a big difference. If we were to lose maybe 400,000 tons of RCN, that makes a huge difference, but we won't. So we look at the potential impacts of this if it continues. Obviously, exports would be delayed further. But the RCN quality, those nuts that are being harvested now are stored in the country, will decline. The infrastructure is not good enough. There's not enough of it, and it's not good enough to store large volumes of raw cashew nuts. And we're already in a low quality season. So people are already getting 44, 45 pounds a month, 6 weeks from now. A little bit of rain, product lying around, not moving, not properly dried. Could be bad news. There is also the possible impact that farmers unable to sell will just not collect the later arrivals. So there is a phenomenon that as the year goes on, if farmers have earned what they see as enough money from their cashews, they don't go to get the later nuts. Obviously the volumes decline, it becomes less and less worthwhile to go and get the later nuts. If they don't, you might see that might impact the final production figure too. Now, getting into the realm of conjecture, it could be that low-priced export contracts could be cancelled or renegotiated by the exporters. Because, logically speaking, it's a situation of force majeure. It's a situation where, right now, you cannot export, and if you cannot export, you can't have a contract. Now that could apply to low price contracts. So that's just something that needs to be considered. I don't think it's on the cards right now, but it is something that needs to be considered. There is also the factor of a loss of confidence in Côte d'Ivoire. You're in the middle of a season, you're buying your raw cashew nuts. The country last year grew over 1.2 million, maybe 1.3 million tons. 860,000 tons of that went for export. And all of a sudden, in the middle of the season, you say to your customers, sorry, ladies and gentlemen, we're suspending exports. So the buyer might go, fine, well, let me go and talk to Nigeria, Guinea-Bissau, Senegal, Guinea, anywhere I can, do my business. And then if you guys want to do something later, we might come back and chat to you then. Meantime, we've talked about the quality going down, nuts not being collected, and the possibility of the cancellation of contracts. So we're looking at what is not a critical situation today, but if it continues for too long, it can develop into a very critical situation. Look at some of the numbers. So these are my numbers based on various discussions. I think there was a little bit of a carry-in of raw cashew nuts from last year. This is not work in progress. This is not the nuts in the factories. This is material, and I think that's a conservative number. If we take a crop of 1.1 million tons, and if we say about 300,000 tons is already gone, there's 25,000 tons in the port, again, a figure, and a processing target of 325,000 tons. Take the land border trade into account. Now, some people would say that number's too low. Others would agree with it. That would mean something like 400,000 tons, 420,000 tons left to come from Côte d'Ivoire this season. And every day that goes by that you can't export it is bad news. Bad news for the industry, bad news for the quality of those raw nuts, and it's probably keeping farm gate prices artificially low. Will this change? I'm sure it will. Last year, something between 85 and 100,000 tons went across the border, exports through Senegal. They're trying to control that a little bit later, a little bit better, which means it comes to market a little bit later. The crop may be lower. Various people say different things. It's a much earlier situation in Guinea-Bissau than it is elsewhere, of course. So if it was 15% lower, you'd be looking at a crop of about 230,000 tons, a loss of something like 35,000 tons. Prices are strong. They're strong because of more actors engaged. They're strong because the system of taxation has changed. And offers are there. And interestingly, reflecting some of the things that have been reported, the offers are for the usual good quality material from Guinea-Bissau. There doesn't seem, at least so far, to be any deterioration in quality as we've seen in other areas of West Africa. So it looks like Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, perhaps Togo, Benin, Burkina have been affected, but this area much less so by declines in quality, but perhaps a little bit by declines in quantity. If we look in Senegal, look, the main thing in Senegal, again, it's very early in the season, is the number of people chasing the raw nuts that are available. So because of the big trade figures last year, which, as I mentioned, was largely material coming out of Guinea-Bissau, because of those numbers, a lot of people have set up trade base in Ziguinchor, looking to buy RCN, and you get too many people chasing too little product, and what do you get? Well, you get inflation. So with the flow from Bissau slowed, you're getting a kind of a price inflation in Senegal. Eventually that will tend to dissipate, but in the meantime, with the number of licensed traders increased phenomenally, more than double. With that number increased, initially everybody's going to go on to go do their job and buy some raw cashew nuts, and that can give a false impression of shortage. It's not that there's necessarily more raw nuts needed or fewer available. It's just that there's more people chasing them. And then you get farm gate price inflation as a result. Okay, so in summary, West Africa, definitely some problems, but probably not as dramatic as we've seen. Certainly farm gate prices are steady in most regions in the eastern part of the region. But if you look in the Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, Gambia sub-region, yes, farm gate prices are pretty strong and export prices reflect those. If Côte d'Ivoire had not temporarily banned the export of raw cashew nuts, prices would probably be a little bit lower. it looks like traders marking up their prices are trying to take advantage of that situation, and why not? That's business. But that buyers are quite conservative and see things maybe slightly differently. What does that add up to? Well, in my view, when we look at the crop, it brings us back to this somewhere between 7% and 14% down compared to 2023. Is that reflected in the fundamental pricing? Very difficult to say. Probably not in the terms of the price of kernels, I would have thought. But -7 to -14 on a bumper crop last year, and it was a bumper crop last year, especially in West Africa, is not the end of the world. So what we need to be really careful of is letting this market get out of hand, developing price bubbles that would be destructive for everyone, especially processors. My key points then on today, and I'm going to finish with the market. I'm going to go to Ernest in a moment to see if there are any questions. I'll talk about African processing the next time instead. I thought it was important to address these issues. My key points: demand is good, trade volumes are good, it looks positive. West Africa, the crops obviously late, obviously lower quality, still coming in. The numbers in terms of trade, in terms of production, don't reflect some of the chat that's been around. I don't see a crop disaster for sure. I don't see prices skyrocketing. I see a lower crop and I see prices correcting. The RCN market is disrupted. It may actually get a bit worse for a while. After the Ivorian ban is lifted, it may become more difficult rather than less difficult. It'll be interesting to see if the ban is lifted, if it would do anything for farm gate prices. Hopefully at that stage, all processors will have bought what they need. Question: is raw cashew nuts prices too low, or are kernels too high, or are kernels too low? It looks to me today and this week the kernels are a little bit too low, and they might see a bit of a correction on that. So you might see kernel prices move up a little bit more. Having said that, contract default is the big unknown that could send prices spiraling further forward. So often in cashews you get the first move up based on the fundamentals, but the second move up is based on contract default, and then it can get out of control on speculation after that. So it's important that we keep a good eye on this situation. It's important that the market generally behaves logically and that people are aware of the reality in the market and the fundamentals that we're seeing in the market. So let me pass you back to Ernest and see if we have any questions. Ernest.
Hi, Jim. Thank you very much. Actually, we have two main questions, maybe a small one also to add. And it has to do with China and also with Côte d'Ivoire. Again, it's for China.
Recording stopped.
For China, it's more about the importance of China to Vietnam. And the question is, how will China at some point transition into cashew processing? And obviously, I think it's something you've touched on in the past. But then again, the question is, what efforts are being made today by China in this direction? So that's the first question. Then let me ask the second one, because the questioner says that actually it's not really a temporary measure, but it's seemingly arbitrary in nature if you look at the way it is done. And whether it will not be better for Côte d'Ivoire to have it for a defined period at the start of the season. And again, you should address this question and link it to the issue of confidence, whether buyers for the 2025 season will arrive early enough, knowing that there could be this kind of, arbitrary measures in place also for 2025. So I think you can take this together. And then the small question is about what will be then the key target markets for exporters from Africa this year. Did you grasp all that?
No. I'll answer the first question. I'll come back to you on the second one.
Okay, very good.
On the first question, no, there's no real evidence at the moment that China is changing toward processing its own cashews, at least in China, but there are Chinese investments in cashew processing in African countries, and there are Chinese investment or prospective investment in cashew processing in Cambodia. So I don't really see that happening as a major factor in the short term. I would see more likely that Cambodia would source a little bit more from Cambodia. So China be sourcing from Cambodia and from Vietnam rather than building its own factories. That would seem to make sense. It would not really make sense to build a factory and create a situation of dependence right now. Don't forget that the Vietnamese dependence on imports evolved over 30 years. It wasn't a situation that happened in the current market circumstances. It was more something that evolved. I didn't quite understand the question with regard to the export ban in Cote d'Ivoire. I think to say that it's not temporary after 2 weeks, after a document that says it's temporary, after the precedent that when it was done in the past, it was temporary, I don't think it's correct to say that it's permanent by any stretch.
Well, the questioner is saying it is not only temporary, but it's seemingly arbitrary in nature also. Because as you said, it's happened before, and there was no real idea as to what triggers it. And the question is, would it not be better to have it for a defined period at the start of the season? And whether indeed, in terms of linkage to confidence, whether buyers will be back early next season when the cashew season starts. Because they know that there could be some kind of a ban they may delay in coming in 2025.
Well, there is plenty of legislation in Cote d'Ivoire to cover access by processors to raw material. And there is a situation where a percentage of the crop is reserved for processors in the country. How that works, in fact, is unclear. How necessary it is unclear, given that if every processing capacity ton was utilized in the country, it wouldn't even use 45% of the crop. So this is about, I think what it's about is a certain group of processors in trouble who need or had the perception that they needed support in buying raw cashew nuts. They had said that there was unfair competition from export. But if we look at the farm gate price this season, I think the minimum was set at 275 CFA. The market now is 300 to 325 CFA. It hasn't moved up as the rest of the market in other countries has moved up, although the quality has come down. So you can say value-wise it has moved up a little bit because people are paying maybe 300 for 45 pounds instead of 48 pounds. So I think that at this point in time, what is concerning is the timing from an export trade point of view. The idea that the export trade would be interrupted mid-season is of concern to buyers. And of course, it will undermine their confidence. And it wouldn't be surprising if the buyers sought some form of reassurance next year that they will have access to the market. It would be a mistake, but it could be that there might be a perception that, well, we are the world's largest producer and, we can do whatever we want. That's obviously not true. That will damage value. If people see risk, they pay lower prices. That's the bottom line in business, and therefore it would impact prices next year. On the other hand, Obviously, the government of Cote d'Ivoire has to do what it sees as the best thing for the country. And they've decided in this case that a temporary ban on the export of RCN is the best thing to do. Personally, I don't agree with them. I think that there will be potentially a price to pay for that, not only this year, but in years to come. Now, let's underline, earlier in the year, there was a ban on the movement of trucks to the port, which was less headline, but was effective. It didn't last very long, but it was put in place. The long-term objective is to achieve at least 50% of the crop to be processed. Interrupting that in the short term may be a mistake, but only time will tell. If, of course, export opens again next week or the week after and people are paying $1,200, $1,250, whatever they're paying, cost and freight, then it will look like there's been no harm done. If they're not, and what is surprising is that I said farm gate prices are stable and they're amongst the lowest in the world, but what is surprising is that they haven't gone down. So you would have expected farm gate prices to go right back down to the minimum and below that. So there is buying going on. We can only conclude that. And of course, the crop is coming in a little bit more slowly this year than in previous years. So this is a complex issue. Personally, I would prefer see people build good supply chains for their processors, encourage processors to do that. That goes for every country, rather than engage in blanket bans. We've seen how difficult they are to manage in Benin. We've seen in the past what a blanket ban on RCN export can do in Kenya. And generally speaking, they haven't worked very well. A more positive approach to the supply chain might be better. Of course, if on Friday or Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday next week somebody says this ban is over, it'll be quickly forgotten and it'll be back to business. What was the third question, Ernest?
Yeah, what will be then the key target market for exporters from Africa this year?
European market imports up, European market interested in sustainable cashews, European market interested in quality, European market prepared to pay prices that make more sense. Looks to me, for volume, European market is the place to go right now. If you've got brokens, you're going to have to look elsewhere, so you might need to look in the United States. If you've got nice quality, large cashew nuts, have a look in the Middle Eastern market. But the logic, when we look at it, in fact, as soon as we're talking about processing, I will show this. Just to look at some of the factors, target market. So if your factory is modern, mechanized, certified, market most likely that you'll be competitive in and that you'll achieve a higher price is the European market. Ernest recognizes these slides because they're his. The second factor is location, the environmental impact of raw cashew nuts traveling around the world and back versus traveling into the European market from West Africa. And there are a number of other factors. So these I will talk about next time. Okay. But to mention them, traceability and supply chain, social impact and justice, new legislation coming in Europe. So for me this year, the best target market would probably be the European market. That's most likely to bring success and most likely to sustain some good prices. And we've seen that recently. I've seen plenty of processors reporting nice prices, attractive prices sold into the European market. Ernest.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jim. Just to also remind you, the next destination is Benin, Cotonou, for the 18th annual ACA Cashew Conference and Expo, and we expect to see you all there. But Jim, I'll hand over back to you now to know what else you have for us.
Well, I've done a lot of talking. I don't know. Look out for these things in the next couple of weeks. Look out for reports on the crop from India. Look out to see if this kernels market moves up above $2.90. If it goes beyond that, it might hit another level that would bring it on even further. Obviously, keep an eye on this temporary ban on RCN exports from Cote d'Ivoire. Listen carefully to see, I mean, if you've bought kernels at low prices, you need to listen to suppliers. Unless you've got the best of suppliers, temptation to delay, default is there. Listen carefully to what they're saying, vice versa too. If you've got a genuine problem, it can be solved, I'm sure. But if you've got a supplier that you're doubtful about, time to keep a close eye on that. If we do get that situation of defaults of contract arising, we could see a kind of a technical follow through on kernels demand and pricing as people seek to replace contracts. And look at this RCN standoff. It's relatively quiet at the moment. Prices have been marked up. Will buyers pay up? Or will some of the exporters drop their prices back a little bit to meet the buying interest? Those are the main things over the next couple of weeks. It's an interesting year. I don't want it to be too exciting because that is often destructive, but it's going to continue to be a very interesting situation. Next time, we're going to have a look at processing because I want to do a little bit of a catch up. But I'm also, and the questioner, thanks for that question because it gave me an opportunity to talk a little bit about target markets. I'm going to have a look at the European market for cashew kernels. What makes it tick, how big it is, what are the grades that are liked there, and how you might access that market. And that'll be our analysis segment. We didn't really do the analysis segment today. There was too much else to talk about. And in the sustainability segment at the end, following on from that subject, I'm going to talk about the links and the need for links between producers and processors. And that's what we kind of spoke about a few minutes ago when we talked about building supply chains rather than meddling with legislation and regulation in the market. That's it from me. Thanks very much. Thank you, Ernest. Thank you, African Cashew Alliance. Thank you to our interpreters. And most of all, thank you to all of those people who join our webinars and especially those who ask questions and make comments. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Until the next time.
Thank you very much, Jim. Thanks to participants and to all the resource team who have made this possible. And till we come your way on the 5th of June, all the best with everything that you're involved in. And see you soon. Bye-bye, everyone. Bye.